US President Donald Trump has repeatedly called tariffs, quote, the most beautiful word. And while countries wait for him to announce fresh tariffs, CNA's Tung explains why one of Southeast Asia's most promising economies was always going to be more vulnerable.
This garment factory in Vietnam's northern Haiphong city is heavily reliant on the US market for revenue. 60% of the products here is exported to the US.
Là hàng bảo hộ y tế, là quần áo cấp cho các bệnh viện, các bác sĩ, các phòng khám. Cho nên là khi cái thời kỳ Covid-19 thì cái nhu cầu về đồng phục y tế tăng đột biến. Cho nên là lượng đơn hàng của chúng tôi rất là lớn và chúng tôi đã có thể xuất khẩu tới hàng triệu sản phẩm trên một tháng.
The company has since expanded to serve its American customers. Business has been booming with confidence here at the factory of 1,200 workers until the victory of Donald Trump.
Chúng tôi đang rất là lo lắng, có thể là để cân bằng cái cán cân thương mại của Việt Nam và Mỹ thì Mỹ sẽ có thể điều chỉnh cái mức thuế suất, không phải là để cho các mặt hàng Việt Nam không được nhập khẩu sang bên Mỹ nữa, mà đang cân bằng lại cái trị giá xuất khẩu và nhập khẩu từ thị trường Việt Nam sang bên Mỹ.
The US trade deficit with Vietnam was the fourth highest, more than 100 billion US dollars. And many are wondering if Vietnam will be next, since Mr. Trump already said he would impose tariffs on imports from countries after he was elected.
Trump has two metrics in particular that he cares a lot about. The first is what he calls the bilateral trade deficit in goods. So he's not interested in services. It's really about trade in goods. And the second is he's got a concern about currency levels. And unfortunately, Vietnam has problems on both of those. It's got one of the largest trade deficits, again, viewed from Washington, that puts it firmly in Trump's crosshairs for some kind of retaliatory actions. And then second, it has a currency that, again, viewed from Washington, or at least viewed from Trump's White House, is going to look terribly undervalued. And so from Trump's perspective, this is two giant black marks against Vietnam that will probably mean Vietnam is going to be pretty high up in that list of countries that he wants to attack early.
Ironically, when Mr. Trump imposed tariffs on imports from China during his first term in office, Vietnam was among the countries that reaped the most gains. The Trump administration announced tariffs on Chinese imports in the second half of 2018, which turned out to be good for Vietnam.
Bởi vì Việt Nam thì tiếp giáp với cả các trung tâm sản xuất công nghiệp lớn của Trung Quốc, đặc biệt là những mặt hàng như điện tử, thì về cơ bản Việt Nam hoàn toàn có một cái lợi thế và có lẽ là không một địa điểm sản xuất nào trên thế giới có thể cạnh tranh được về yếu tố vị trí địa lý đó.
That didn't go unnoticed by then President Trump. When asked about the trend of companies moving to Vietnam and whether he would impose tariffs on Vietnam, he said his administration was in discussion with Vietnam. He went on to call Vietnam almost the single worst abuser of everybody. And he even said Vietnam takes advantage of the US worse than China. Vietnam eventually emerged unscathed from the first Trump presidency. In fact, in 2019, the year after tariffs on China was announced, foreign direct investment into Vietnam peaked, increasing more than 7% year on year to hit a record 38 billion US dollars, a level which remains unbeaten today.
Vietnam did very well out of Trump 1. They attracted an awful lot of inbound investment, including out of China, but also firms that had previously been in China. Many of them had already been looking at Vietnam before the Trump administration came into office, but that certainly his trade war accelerated production in Vietnam. And you can see that in the figures right now, where Vietnam's trade with the US has simply exploded over the last 8 years. So I think Vietnam did well in Trump 1. However, and I think this is key, it is unlikely to do anywhere near as well in Trump 2. And in fact, because it's been such a success, in a piece of irony, it's likely to do much worse in Trump 2.
2025 could usher in many unknowns as Mr. Trump takes office. Yet this potential uncertainty in its largest export market and the possible threat of tariffs doesn't appear to have faced the Vietnamese leadership. Vietnam's economy grew by more than 7% last year, beating its own target as well as forecasts by the World Bank and the IMF. And this year, the government has set a high economic growth target of 8 to 10% as the governing Communist Party of Vietnam gears up for an all-important political meeting in January 2026. This may not be entirely unachievable, even given the current global climate.
Vietnam is still a very bright spot in an otherwise gloomy economic picture for a lot of the world. And so even notwithstanding the disruption out of the US, it will remain a very attractive market. And it will especially become an attractive market for other potential investors or firms who are thinking about non-US final destination products, so into Europe, into Asia, etc.
At the factory in Haiphong, the company is playing it a little more cautiously. They say they are trying whatever they can to reduce the risks from Mr. Trump's potential tariffs. They are doubling efforts to increase automation at the factory to reduce costs. And the firm is also looking into other potential markets. Like many other companies in Vietnam, they are bracing for a challenging 2025 with major economic headwinds brought on by Trump 2.0. Tung, CNA, Hà Nội.